So in yesterday's video, I said that I wanted to talk about metaphor a little more, because if you understand this whole notion of the metaphor only superficially, in the sense of, in a shallow way, you're going to really struggle with understanding NI. You're really going to struggle to understand how one of the main gifts that NI is indeed gifted with is the ability to understand the language of the unconscious. So to understand the unconscious pretty profoundly. Metaphor is a primary process, a primitive process of the psyche in the unconscious primarily. It expresses itself, of course, in consciousness through paths of alleviation of the unconscious itself, but also through our own creative activity. In this sense, any kind of creative activity that we consciously engage in is a bridging with the unconscious, right? Sometimes quite obvious, in poetry, for example, sometimes not so obvious. Not all forms of creative enterprise seem to be connected with the unconscious, and yet they are. But I wanted to talk about the importance of the symbol in this, because if the figure of speech, with speech understood in a very broad sense, if the figure of speech is the public face of metaphor, as we understand it, the non-public face of metaphor, the private face of metaphor, the part of metaphor that remains buried in the unconscious, is the symbol. And I've made videos before where I try to explain what the difference is between a symbol and a sign. I'm not going to return to this. You can refer back to those videos if you want to understand that. You need to understand that too, to be clear on what distinguishes the sign from the symbol. To be honest, the deepest writer on what makes the symbol singular and why we should not confuse it with the sign, is Jung himself. There are topics where I think Jung is not the deepest writer, where I think Freud is deeper, Klein is deeper, Lacan is deeper, Nietzsche is deeper, Wittgenstein is deeper, Heidegger is deeper, and so forth and so on. But on the symbol, clearly Jung is the deepest writer. You understand that he was really one of the first to suggest that the symbol is not an abstract entity, it's a concrete entity, it's a living entity, and it has a kind of lifespan. Insofar as it's a living entity, it's not a complete entity. It's not a perfect entity. That's also what sets desire in motion in people. If you like, the very kernel of the fundamental fantasy. I'm sorry to kind of speak in a way that takes for granted you've been following my videos and you've been following my work. If I'm going too fast, if I'm using too much of my own jargon at this point, do let me know in the comments. I can definitely slow down in future videos, okay? That's not an issue. The important thing is that you understand me, that you're able to follow me, because this is very important. So, every person has a fundamental fantasy. Fantasy with PH, unconscious structuring of experience by the fundamental fantasy. One of my great theses in current work, and this will all be encapsulated hopefully nicely in my future book on NI. The thesis is that depending on what your dominant function is, even more so than your type, depending on what your dominant function is, your fundamental fantasy is going to be different. And in the case of NI dominance, my thesis is that the most common fundamental fantasy is the fantasy of repair. Right, I've talked about this. Hopefully you're up to date with that. Type is going to determine how the fantasy of repair is further expressed, articulated, justified, given life, including social life, in the world. But the basic fundamental fantasy, I don't think is determined by type so much as it is determined by dominant function, because the dominant function gives someone's inner world. Okay, it gives also the texture of the unconscious, and of course, fundamental fantasy is unconscious. When it penetrates through, when it gets through the cracks of consciousness and manifests itself as fleeting fantasies with an F, it's no longer unconscious. But these are only really the top of the iceberg, okay? So the fundamental fantasy is the fantasy of fantasies. It also has a structure, it also has a core, it also has a kernel. And this kernel, which is what holds everything together as a Borromean knot of the unconscious, is the symbol. The symbol in its most, really in this quintessential sense. There is just one symbol. Of course, there are other symbols, but they're all derivatives of this one symbol in the person's life. This symbol, well, it's difficult to describe, partly because it is living and because it is not complete. The fact that it is alive, the fact that it is concrete. It is concrete, but not complete, right? In the same sense that as a person, I can say I'm complete. Tomorrow I might lose my eyes, I don't know, I hope not, or I might lose my mind, right? If I were complete, that couldn't happen. So clearly, the fact that I'm in time sort of militates against my completeness. It's the same with the symbol. It's an entity. It's not really even an entity. It's like it's a concrete thing in the psyche. And Jung, again, like I said, really understood this better than anyone else. Concrete condensation of experience, which in turn provides the core of that which organizes experience, the fantasy. The insight here is, and in this regard, Kant, I think, was wrong, Jung was right. That which organizes experience is in turn shaped by the experiences we have. It's a living dynamic, okay? So the fantasy is informed and progressively changed. At least it is refined, it's changed, it's modified, it evolves according to the experiences that we ourselves have in our lives, which means that even for those people, let's say on a dominance, of whom we can really say their fundamental fantasy is a fantasy of repair, each person will have a different kind of expression, including a symbolic expression of that fantasy, simply by virtue of the fact that everyone has a different kind of life. Now the symbol, as you will see, this is kind of a scoop, I can give you this little spoiler, is an inscription in the mind. This is the one way in which we could describe it. Of course, I'm using metaphor to do this, but as I already said, metaphor is the language of the unconscious. There's no way we can talk about the unconscious if we don't talk metaphorically. So the symbol is an inscription in the mind. In later content, I'm going to shock you even more and say it's a wound in the mind. And a wound is a kind of inscription, if you think about it, like if when you have a scar. Very important, psychoanalytically. Anyway, it's an inscription in the mind, and it provides the basic unit of unconscious language. This inscription, which is the symbol, we can attempt to talk about in writing, like I will do in my NI notes and my NI book, by means of a sign. Now, a sign is not ideal because, again, it's different from a symbol, but we can try to approximate a symbol with a sign that it looks as much like a symbol as possible. And it will be the open circle. It will be the open circle. That's what that's what I will have in my NI book to stand as a stand-in for the symbol of the fundamental fantasy of repair. Because it stands for the open womb. An open wound and an open womb. And I leave you with that for now. Okay, guys? Don't forget you can support me on Patreon, guys. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. It's not expensive. A few bucks a month, a few bucks a year. You get access to some cool content like all my extensive back catalog of deep dive videos only for Patreon, exclusive deep dives into long, like 20 to 30 minute video length format, going into topics that you choose. The latest one was on NI mysticism and magic. And you also have access to our Discord server, the Fourfold, exclusive for patrons. Interact with me on a daily basis. Wouldn't that be nice? So it would be lovely to welcome you there. And in return, of course, you help me massively to keep the channel going. Could not do it without you. So hopefully consider it. Hope you consider it. Also, check out my books if you haven't got them yet on the INFJ. Ecstatic Soul on the internal world of the INFJ. Infinite Soul in the external world of the INFJ. For a deep understanding, you need those books. They're both linked below. So get them if you haven't yet. And I'll talk to you tomorrow, guys. Bye-bye.